chose to do a lesson over layers of the atmosphere, and I just did it with one of my classes. I chose to do it with my advanced class this year, and the reason why I did it is because this is not really a lesson that I thought I've taught well in the past. This topic seems kind of abstract to some of my students, and really they just don't seem as engaged with this as I think they could be, or as they have been with other topics we've talked about in science. So my main goal for my lesson, which ended up taking a few days, was that students will be able to design a presentation over one layer of the atmosphere by completing a web quest. And then there are some objectives for them to complete. Given websites from me on the web quest, students will be able to complete his or her section of the project. After viewing presentations from classmates, students will be able to identify the features in each layer by listing two main characteristics. And then the final assessment to make sure that they understood the main gist of it was, given a diagram of the atmospheric layers, students will be able to label the layers in order 2 out of 3 times. So here is the web quest that students were given to go to. So here's a little brief introduction that we all read through. So basically, I'm going to go to the task section. I'm going to kind of read through this quickly. For this activity, each group and student within the group will have different tasks and topics. So the different topics are the different levels of the atmosphere, and there were 5, as you can see here. So group 1 was doing the troposphere, group 2 stratosphere, 3 mesosphere, 4 thermosphere, and 5 exosphere. And then within that, each group was going to focus on one portion of that layer. So let's go down here to the 4 different tasks that we had. And how I did this with numbers, I made sure that there were 2 fact finders, and then I tried to just have 1 for the other ones, but how it worked out was just because of, not having even numbers, I think a couple groups had 2 article finders. So if you were the photographer, you had to find pictures that related to that layer of the atmosphere, and you would email your pictures to the columnist. Fact finders, they were responsible for finding 10 facts about their layer altogether. I said they had to find these 3 things: the temperature, air pressure, and thickness. But then the other 7 that they found were up to them. And then the article finder had to find other articles, magazines, books about the levels of the atmosphere. I actually took my classes to the Media Center to complete this project. Well, took the one class that did it, and allowed them to go look for books in the Media Center. And they could also search for just online websites or articles that they thought would relate to that layer. And then finally, the last job was the columnist. And they are responsible for typing everything up to create the presentation that they would use to teach the other groups about that layer of the atmosphere. I said they can make a PowerPoint or Sway, which is something we use at my school. It's like a Microsoft-based presentation tool. To present the group's information, the presentation had to include all the facts from the fact finder, all the articles, and the pictures from the photographer. And I said I wanted them to make it creative and make sure it contained all the information. One thing that I would change next time is instead of having like a separate columnist, I would maybe make everybody kind of do this and maybe add something else, because while the photographer, fact finders, and article finders were looking for their information, the columnist was just kind of sitting there. I mean, for this class, because I chose to do this with my advanced class, they were kind of stepping in and helping the other ones find the information. But I could see where this could cause some classroom management issues if there's one student that doesn't have anything to do at the time. So that might be something I changed if I did this again. So I did have some websites listed for each of the groups to go through. This was very helpful for my students because I try to teach them about having reliable resources, and they could watch the YouTube videos that were embedded, and I think this helped them to kind of develop some research skills, because they're so used to just going into Google, typing in quick answers, and if they can't find it right on that little blurb that Google gives you, then they just give up. So I told them to use these to search through, and then they also could go look through books in the Media Center to see if they found any information. Here was the rubric that I used. I did find this, got this rubric from online. I modified the project that another teacher had done. So we went through this. I'm not going to go through it because I've kind of gone through everything. And the conclusion, okay, was that it was time for presentations to begin. And I stressed to the kids that whenever we do jigsaw groups, that you have two roles. You have your role as the teacher, but then you also have a role as a learner, and each are equally important. So before we went through and actually taught these, I made sure that the kids knew what their expectations were when they were teaching, and then when they were also being the student and learning about the other layers of the atmosphere. Here is the kind of the assessment that I used. So what I did is this diagram right here. I tried to create this on like a sheet of butcher paper, and originally I said right here that I would have 3 to 4 students at once, but for time's sake I actually ended up doing one for each of the tables, or for each of the groups, so there were 5 different ones. And we kind of did like a self-check, or like students were assessing other members in their group, because I realized if I was having to check every single kid, that would take, and because I wanted them to do it 2 out of 3 times. So if every student is doing that 3 times in a class of 30, that's 90 times I'm having to watch students do this. So I was trying to come up with a more efficient way, and I decided to do like peer assessing. And it worked out really well, and they got into it. And based on the results from this, it seemed like they got it, which I think this is a fairly easy assessment. But this was the main thing that I wanted them to be able to understand, were the layers in order. So for the most part, they got it. And there was just like 2 or 3 students who only got it 1 time instead of 2 out of the 3 times. And I was able to work with them the next day and make sure they got it. And in terms of timing for this project, what I did is introduce the project during the last part of One Class One Day, and kind of went through and described each of the roles and just did an introduction with the kids. And the next day I assigned the groups the roles and their layers, and so that way we didn't have to take that part of class to go over the instructions for the web quest. And they were able, for the most part, to finish everything they needed to do in one 50-minute class period. But then I did this part, the assessment, at the beginning of the next class. So I think ideally this would take 2 class periods. Oh, I'm sorry. Okay. So we had, I forgot about the teaching. So I introduced it the last part of one class, and then it took them a day to complete their presentations, and then it took a day to teach the presentations and have them write down their information. So then this assessment was done on the 3rd day of the lesson. So I think that it could be done all within 3 days with the introduction, presentations, teaching, and assessment. I think you could do that in a 3-day time period. I think that if I were to make changes to this activity, I already talked about changing the role of the columnist, but possibly instead of having students create a presentation, maybe taking a little bit longer with it and having them do a video or a model of their layer, or maybe at the end having them, after they've learned about all 5 layers, then creating the model to show that they understand the characteristics. I just think that it was a little simplified, in particular for my advanced class that I did this with, and I think that they would get even more out of it if they were challenged on the like creativity level for this project.